Picture yourself in a stone-walled kitchen, somewhere in 12th century England. It's just before dawn. The hearth glows with last night's embers, and someone, a very tired someone, is reheating porridge that has been sitting out all night in what can only be described as a cauldron of mild despair. Yes, we begin, dear dreamer, with porridge, because oddly enough, the humble porridge pot has survived the medieval ages, both literally and culturally, in kitchens around the world. Yours even. That daily bowl of oatmeal is just aristocratic gruel wearing a fibre-forward disguise. Back in the Middle Ages, porridge wasn't just breakfast. It was breakfast, lunch, dinner, and depending on how forgiving the livestock were that year, dessert too. But here's the kicker. It wasn't made fresh each time. Medieval cooks kept an eternal porridge pot, a never-ending, always simmering vessel of mush, a bubbling, sticky vortex of barley, oats, sometimes peas or leeks, and, depending on luck or lack thereof, yesterday's rabbit. This dish was poetically, or perhaps ominously, referred to as perpetual stew, a name which sounds like a noble endeavour from a fantasy novel, but in this context meant one simple thing. They rarely cleaned the pot, they just added more to it. Porridge, my sleepers, was less of a meal and more of a lifestyle commitment. Now, in fairness, the logic was sound. Kitchens didn't have refrigeration. The closest they had was opening a tiny wooden window in winter and hoping marauding sheep didn't wander in. So if you had a stew that had been simmering consistently and hadn't yet developed the ability to speak or vote, you simply fed it like a pet, a very clingy culinary pet from which all meals must be birthed, and you didn't need a recipe. You simply added whatever's available. On Monday, that might be ale-soaked bread and onion tops. Thursday might bring in bruised apples, fish bones, and, surprise twist, lavender if someone got confused in the dark. Flavour was more of an accidental friend than a planned guest. Of course, even now some of this lingers on. Slow cooker meals that go on for days. The broth your grandmother claims is always better on day 7. The suspiciously infinite soup at diners open 24 hours. Somewhere, beneath all that modern seasoning, is the soul of perpetual porridge. Whispering tales of turnip roots, and the time the Lord's nephew dropped a ring in the stew, and they all pretended not to notice. But it wasn't just what went into the pot. It was also how and with what you ate it that reveals another awkward echo through time. Forks, for example, were rare and somewhat suspicious, widely regarded, and brace yourself here, as unmanly. Yes, when forks first tried to make their debut in medieval Europe, people found them unnecessary, overly delicate, and even sinful. The logic was that God gave you fingers, and if God had intended you to jab boiled lentils with tiny pitchforks, he would have installed them at the ends of your arms. So most folks simply dipped 3 fingers into the communal porridge and hoped for the best, a practice which, if tried at your next office potluck, might get you quietly escorted from the premises. Yet, we haven't fully abandoned this. Consider chips, French fries that is, or chicken nuggets, pizza crust, the things we still enjoy not with forks, but with scripturally sanctioned digits. There's a faint medieval echo in every bite of handheld food, a whisper of those times when using cutlery might brand you a villain from a suspiciously pointy kingdom. And flavour. Let us not forget that in medieval cooking, the goal wasn't always to enhance the food. Sometimes it was to distract from it. Spices were signs of wealth, yes, but they also helped hide the scent of meats that had bravely faced one too many summer afternoons without preservation. it's why. Cinnamon ended up in meat pies and pepper in absolutely everything, including possibly the bath. So the next time you sprinkle cinnamon on your morning oats, remember that you are participating in a culinary sleight of hand passed down from chefs wielding ladles the size of oars, gently disguising 4-day-old duck. Now, drift gently on the notion that someone, somewhere, is still stirring a pot that's never truly empty. Stirring, and perhaps dreaming of the glorious day when someone invents Tupperware. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Go ahead and get comfortable. We're just beginning our quiet exploration of the curious ways food and fingers have shaped history. Somewhere between the high stone walls of medieval kitchens and the low hum of candlelit feasting halls, a curious sound could often be heard just beneath the clanking of pewter and the slosh of ale. The eager suckling of fingers. Let us not be coy. Forks were once considered suspicious at best, sinful at worst, and entirely unnecessary by pretty much everyone in between. In some corners of 14th century Europe, using a fork was tantamount to insulting God's own design. After all, He gave us fingers, didn't He? So meals were not eaten. They were negotiated. Picture a nobleman, resplendent in velvet, hose, and perhaps the faint scent of turnip, daintily dunking his bare hand into a communal bowl of pottage, scooping up broth thick with barley and radish, then raising it to his mouth like a pilgrim presenting a relic to the heavens. Though lessons in etiquette did exist, they were often observed with the same enthusiasm that modern people give to instructions on assembling flat-pack furniture. Acknowledged briefly, then abandoned entirely. Table manners were, shall we say, evolving. Now, if you're wondering about napkins, a charming accessory that has saved many a shirt from the tyranny of spaghetti sauce, I regret to inform you that medieval folks had no such civilized cloth between their mouth and misfortune. Instead, diners frequently used the tablecloth. Yes, the whole tablecloth. In fact, it was not uncommon to see someone casually wiping their hands, their knife, and occasionally their face, directly onto the grand drapery that covered the trestle table, and then continuing their meal as though nothing had occurred. And what was truly magical about all this was that the person sitting next to you was probably doing the same, or worse, licking their fingers with gusto just before plunging those same digits back into the communal trencher. Ah yes, the trencher. Imagine dining off a plate made of stale bread. That, dear listener, was the trencher experience. These bread platters were carved thick for sturdiness and soaked, with meat drippings, gravy, and the occasional rogue beet. By the end of the meal, they were either eaten by the diner, passed off to the poor, or more likely, tossed to the dogs beneath the table. The very same dogs who may have been licking the floor only moments before. In this way, medieval meals were an intimate affair, not just in atmosphere, but also in microbiology. Everyone shared everything, utensils, dishes, viruses. It was culinary socialism, with a side of dysentery. But what does this mean for us today? Well, you may have noticed, at more casual gatherings, say a barbecue or birthday party with finger foods, that humanity hasn't entirely escaped its roots. A plate of nachos is but a modern trencher, really. 7-layer dip, a communal pottage. And though most of us now carry forks and napkins to polite society, many still betray their medieval ancestors with the occasional mysterious insistence on eating pizza with their hands, while simultaneously frowning at others who do the same with chicken wings. We are walking contradictions wrapped in cloth napkins. And then there's salt, the humble mineral once locked away like treasure. In medieval times, salt was not offered freely. It was hoarded, honored, and carefully dispensed. During feasts, a prominent salt cellar would sit solemnly in the center of the table. To sit above the salt was an honor. To be seated below it, a quiet social judgment. It's one of those subtle customs that has faded, but not without leaving its mark. Even now, when someone passes you the salt without the pepper, or worse, you can't find where someone's moved it. There is a faint echo of ancient scorn that wafts through the air like the ghost of a pickled herring. Because you see, salt wasn't just a seasoning. It was a power structure, a crystal hierarchy, one tiny pinch at a time. And so, while your dinner table may now feature porcelain rather than porridge bowls, and your salad fork may rest peacefully beside your soup spoon, small details still carry the weight of centuries. Tiny customs, like who serves, who cuts, who fetches the gravy boat, all hum with the faintest whisper of feasts long forgotten. Let's keep our forks poised for now, because next, a darker side of mealtime might just be hiding in the kitchen's oldest foe. Refrigeration's rude and rotten ancestor, preservation. Of all the unsettling remnants of medieval cuisine that still quietly linger today, few are as quietly persistent and oddly unnerving as the medieval obsession with disguise. Somewhere along the long and winding road from the clanging feasts of lords and ladies to the late-night fridge raids of weary interns, the act of making food look like other food has refused to die. Let's begin with one of the most theatrically confusing dishes, the cockatrice. This culinary Frankenstein's monster was a hybrid creature, stitched together from the noble head and upper body of a roasted pig and the lower half of a plucked trussed chicken, or sometimes the other way around, depending on how chaotic the cook was feeling that day. Do you feel your shoulders relaxing? Good. Just imagine yourself at a banquet in 1372, watching a sizzling pig-chicken creature being wheeled in with far too much ceremony. It's a kind of edible centaur, noble, confusing, crispy. This dish wasn't created out of necessity or even hunger. It was a flex, a splashy display of wealth, power, and a deeply questionable sense of humor. You see, medieval cooks were a bit like jesters in aprons. They were often tasked with not just feeding guests, but bewildering them. If a dish didn't make the room gasp, laugh, or break into spontaneous prayer, had you really entertained at all? Even when they weren't building mythical meat monsters, cooks in the Middle Ages were still delightfully deceptive. Take the practice of pretending meat was fruit. Yes, indeed. Ever heard of illusion foods? These were meals carefully sculpted, dyed, and glazed to resemble something else entirely. Apples made from minced veal and breadcrumbs, grapes made of blanched almonds, held together with sugar syrup and unreasonable ambition. You might be wondering, why did deception matter so much in an age where people were constantly worried about whether their drinking water had leeches in it? Consider this. In a world of limited literacy and little entertainment, dinner was theatre. Meals were narratives in grease and gravy. Each course was an act, a story told in gelatinous tableau. And if your noble guests arrived expecting roasted swan, but received a moulded fish tart painted to look like a bouquet of tulips, you were doing hospitality right. Of course, while medieval illusion dishes might sound like fantastical nonsense, we haven't fully let them go. Have you ever sliced into a birthday cake only to discover it's shaped like a cheeseburger? Have you watched with quiet panic as someone sliced a life-size shoe that turned out to be made of chocolate sponge cake and fondant laces. Yes, the cake is not what it seems. Trend lives on. Beneath it lies a faint echo of medieval kitchens, of cooks hunched over their work tables, whispering to themselves as they glue a goose to a rabbit. Even the humble meat pie, that eternal lunchbox companion and midnight regret, owes a debt to these medieval food sculptors. In the Middle Ages, the pie crust was a tough, inedible shell called a coffin, meant purely to encase the filling and survive baking in rustic ovens that occasionally doubled as light industrial furnaces. These pastry fortresses often doubled as serving dishes, garnished with elaborate patterns and sometimes inscribed with family heraldry. Picture a pie that could not only burn your mouth, but also establish your social standing. In some of the grandest medieval banquets, pies were used to deliver surprises, real surprises. You may recall the old nursery rhyme about 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie. While they probably weren't fully baked, lest you end up with 24 rather deceased birds and one confused duke, it was a thing to place live animals, birds, frogs, occasionally dwarves, under these massive pie crusts, so that when the dish was cracked open, out flew a feathery spectacle of chaos and shrieking amazement. Today's dinner theatre lacks this level of audacity, and probably for good reason. As you gently drift where pie-shaped memories ripple through history, let this odd chapter of food confusions wrap around you like a warm, buttery crust. The desire to turn dinner into a little magic trick never quite left us. Just perhaps next time you see sushi shaped like a teddy bear, spare a thought for the 14th century cook trying to pass off venison as pears. And while the flavors may have faded, the spirit of playful deception still tiptoes across our dinner plates, softly pointing us toward the next strange, simmering quirk, where medieval people once believed spices might change your soul. There is something resolutely noble about cheese, isn't there? A food brave enough to be both solid and squishy, dignified on a cheese board, yet equally at home melting onto a peasant's stale bread. It has survived centuries, revolutions, and all known plagues of Europe. But cheese wasn't always this friendly little dairy sponge we know. In medieval times, it had character, and occasionally, a faint smell of feet. Now, you're probably picturing monks serenely pressing wheels of matured Gruyere in a cozy alpine monastery. And yes, some monks genuinely dedicated their lives to crafting cheeses as ancient as their hairlines. But much of medieval cheese was what scholars might gently refer to as chaotic neutral. It fermented in cellars, or, alarmingly, under beds. It came in curious shades, textures ranging from linty to craggy, and possessed aromas so advanced they'd need their own tax bracket today. Folks in the 13th century didn't have modern refrigeration, or a sound understanding of hygiene, if we're being honest. So cheese's evolution from milk to thing we still dare eat was more of a courageous improvisation than a science. They relied on the mood of the moon, the whims of weather, and most remarkably, the bacteria lurking quietly on their own hands. Unsettling, yes. Effective, also yes. The English called their early rustic cheeses green cheese, not for the colour, but because they were young, soft, and, truth be told, a little gooey. These were eaten fast or buried far away from noses. Harder cheeses, the kind that could endure several pilgrimages across Europe, were saluted as long-keeping treasures. Some were so durable, they doubled as makeshift weapons in tavern brawls. Imagine being concussed by a cheddar across the Channel in what is now France, where cheese was practically issued at birth. things were equally pungent. The French developed cheeses that required such delicate nurturing. It was like nursing a small dairy pet. You fed it mold. You flipped it daily. You whispered kindly as it matured. And in the end, it rewarded you with a flavor that was half cream, half existential dread. Of course, what made medieval cheese particularly unruly was the milk itself. You see, there were no government safety inspections, no best before parish codes, and certainly no pasteurization. Cows grazed on whatever was available. This often included wild herbs, flowers, and let's just call them accidents of nature, all of which flavored the milk, which flavored the cheese, which flavored the peasant's afternoon indigestion. Still, cheese was democratic. Everyone from the lowliest mud-dusted crofter to the most illustrious gout-ridden nobleman partook of the dairy prizes. Peasants crumbled it into pottage, a thick stew of wild things and happenstance. Nobles, on the other hand, might pair it with imported quince paste, or spend absurd sums hosting cheese courses, which were essentially medieval tasting menus, with a slight air of danger. Even royalty got in on the action. Charlemagne himself, that grand Teutonic Magnifico, once wrote a letter praising a particular cheese he encountered in the region of Reblochon. He described it with such enthusiastic reverence, historians now speculate that he might have fallen in love, just a little bit, with the cheese. And here's where things take a curious turn toward today. If you've ever clutched a grilled cheese sandwich at 2 a.m. during an emotional pickle, or stolen a wedge of brie from a charcuterie board when nobody was watching, well, you've participated in a tradition older than your DNA. Cheese has always been there, miraculously surviving refrigeration disasters, cocktail parties, and centuries of questionable stomachs. It is both comfort and culinary archaeological site. The medieval world may have wrapped their cheeses in leaves, ashes, or linen soaked in wine, but their spirit lives on. In your supermarket's surprisingly smelly cheese aisle, that little wedge wrapped in bespoke wax, it has ancestry. That dairy-free, oat-based cheese product, well, not all descendants turn out majestic. And yet, in every creamy spoonful or heroic cheese pull, we taste the wild bravery of a time when people trusted their instincts and their smell receptors to guide them safely from milk to miracle. Now, my dear, while the cheeses of old settle back into their cellars and the monks snuff out their candles, let's tiptoe a bit further into the realm of medieval table rules, where elbows were scandalous, fingers were forks, and everyone eyed the napkin suspiciously. Ah, the medieval kitchen. Not quite the cozy, herb-scented hearth of a modern farmhouse fantasy, and not quite the flaming pit of culinary despair people tend to imagine either. It fell somewhere between "I forged this sauce in a thunderstorm" and "Oops, the pig ate my shoe again." But nestled in those smoky rafters of yesteryear's kitchens are habits. Oh yes, deeply questionable, ear-twitching habits that have tiptoed quietly into modern life. Let's begin with your average medieval stew, also known as whatever survived the last frost and wasn't stolen by the neighbor's goat. These stews simmered for hours, sometimes days, fed and re-fed with meat scraps, onions, mystery forest greens, more onions, dried legumes, a single apple, and if you were lucky, a bit of wine someone forgot to drink. Think of it as a never-ending hot tub group project for ingredients. But wait, days you say? Yes, a good cook in a medieval manor knew how to keep a pottage bubbling on the fire essentially forever, like your very own eternal soup. One recipe from 14th century France even described it as perpetual. The trick? Just keep adding things to replace what you ate. A dash of herbs here, a new bone there, that leftover cabbage you accidentally sat on. This is where modern soup culture inherits its reckless optimism about leftovers. Now, I won't name names, but there are modern soup joints still operating under the quiet assumption that if they keep stirring, no one notices how long ago the base was made. It's a rather romantic echo of culinary stubbornness, and a gentle reminder that our ancestors believed in partnering with time itself to make dinner. Let's now slip inside the walls of a medieval banquet. Imagine a blurry Game of Thrones set, but with more mead and fewer feelings. Here, the elite ate as much for theatrical sparkle as for nourishment. Food was dyed with bright saffron or beet juice, turned into edible animals, moulded into flags, towers, saints. Peacocks were plucked, roasted, and then carefully redressed in their own feathers, posed impressively on the platter. It's slightly horrifying, but also, it's basically Instagram food, just with more feathers. You think latte art is new? Think again. The medieval elite adored presentation. Their cooks sculpted soft cheese into fish, even disguised meat as fruit, a practice now charmingly known as deceptive cookery. There's your medieval TikTok challenge. Guess what this actually is? Spoiler, it's eels. Speaking of eels, we really must have a quiet word about fish, because if medieval Europe had a comfort animal, it was the eel. Freshwater eels, smoked eels, jelly eels, pies full of eels. These squiggling delicacies were absolutely everywhere. Not just for their taste, mind you, but because they swam right into the loopholes of fasting rules. Back then, Fridays and around 150 other days a year were no-meat days, part of religious life. But eels, slippery, deviant little creatures, weren't meat by ecclesiastical standards. They were fish, which meant one could scarf down a greasy eel tart and sleep soundly, knowing your mortal soul remained largely intact. Fast forward to now, and while eel may have dropped off the Western dinner plate, its legacy lingers. Sushi menus, for instance, cradle-grilled eel as a delicacy, and certain English pubs still honour jellied eel as if nothing ever changed. It's like spotting a medieval ghost haunting your appetizer. But let's not forget the real culinary superhero of medieval mishaps: spices. Oh yes, cloves and cinnamon weren't just wintry friends, they were absolute status symbols. These were the flex of the elite. If your venison stew didn't reek of nutmeg, were you even a lord? People believe spices were used to mask rancid meat. Not quite. They were much too expensive to waste on bad cuts. More likely, if your dish was dripping in saffron, it was your edible resume. I have trade connections, sharp taste, and a strong sense of drama. Now, fast forward to your pantry. See that cinnamon? That nutmeg you perhaps fall upon every December. Their roles as cozy companions began with aristocratic swagger in banquet halls of the 1300s, poured recklessly over goose and pears, and even, with some wild abandon, into oysters. So next time you sprinkle cinnamon on a latte and snap a photo, remember, you're just continuing an ancient tradition of yelling, "Look, I have spices," without speaking. And with that softly aromatic thought whirling like steam from a slow pot, let's gently turn the spoon again. Onward to another forgotten flavour of the past, where comfort met confusion in the realm of medieval dining. There is a quiet absurdity in how fiercely medieval people distrusted raw vegetables. A peasant could stare down the barrel of a feverish winter with 10 leeks and a hope, yet still believe that eating uncooked greens might summon demons into his intestines. To be fair, they weren't completely wrong. In the absence of refrigeration, pasteurization, or the concept of maybe wash. That, a raw turnip, was indeed a dicey gamble. But what makes this distrust so delightfully odd is the seriousness with which it was enforced. Entire culinary philosophies were built upon the premise that cold, watery foods could imbalance your humours, send your spleen spiralling, or cause flatulence in public. A sin worse, arguably, than actual murder in some monastic dining halls. In stone kitchens lit only by firelight and damp fog, cooks waged personal wars against freshness. Lettuce had to be stewed. Cucumbers, according to the eminent medieval medical faculty of Paris, should be boiled no less than twice and preferably buried. Yes, buried in dirt, because somehow that seems safer than eating them as the Lord created. The guiding force behind this verdant paranoia was the ever-blinking spectre of the humoral theory, a charmingly flawed system cooked up by the ancients and simmered for over 1,000 years through thick European superstition. According to this theory, the human body floated precariously in a broth of 4 bodily juices: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. Because that sounds appealing, each food therefore needed to match your inner stew. Cold and moist foods, like cucumbers, might tip the scales into full phlegmatic collapse, a condition that apparently caused sluggishness, melancholy, or the sudden urge to quote Virgil at dinner parties. Now celery, poor stringy celery, had it even worse. It was feared as overly cooling to the body and considered a dangerous seductress of the digestive tract. Yes, celery, that noble stalk, whispering crunch into modern life's peanut butter. In medieval kitchens, it was often boiled into anonymity, served afloat in puddles of weary broth so it wouldn't offend anyone's inner constitution. To this day, celery rarely travels alone. It hides quietly in soups, in stuffing, in Bloody Marys incongruously adorned with bacon, an existential regret. And what about salads? Ah, the fatal temptation. Salads were like culinary Russian roulette in ye old times. A brave noble might nibble a few leaves tossed with oil and vinegar, if he were feeling particularly reckless, or if his cook had read an extremely convincing pamphlet about arugula. But mostly, salads were seen as the gateway drug to dysentery, which is both fair and underscores just how essential salt pork and boiling everything into beige mush became to survival. Yet, even as raw vegetables haunts medieval Europe's nightmares, something curious sprouted in the gardens of monasteries: herbal medicine. The very same monks who would not dare consume a raw onion after Vespers were nonetheless meticulously growing entire plots of parsley, sage, and chamomile, ostensibly for healing. Not eating, heavens no. Eating herbs was for reckless Greco-Romans and Italians, but steeped in tea, applied to a blister, slathered on with prayer and modest confusion, entirely acceptable. This polite contradiction persists. Even now, our modern palates are dotted with flavors that began as curatives rather than cuisine. Mint, originally a medieval cough remedy, now freshens breath between Tinder dates. Mustard, one of the era's few tolerated condiments, was recommended for moving sluggish bowels as well as spicing boiled meats. Its zing still lingers on hot dogs and in recipes that swear by Dijon as a secret ingredient. And the resolute European fear of uncooked vegetation quietly echoes in how we still boil vegetables into softness, or look sideways at kale unless it's been massaged like a fussy Victorian duchess. The humble salad, once daubed with suspicion, has risen to cultural superstardom in the form of power bowls, which are really just medieval pottage that went to therapy read a personal growth book, and added feta. So next time you reach for that meticulously sanitized bunch of spinach, remember, you are defying centuries of intestinal paranoia. That little act of salad-eating rebellion is an insult to a world that thought grapes had to be boiled first, lest they inflame the humours. But before we pack away our carrots and conspiracy theories, let us tiptoe beyond the cabbage patch, for there lies another tale of what happened when medieval people tried to impress their guests with more than just safety, but with spectacle. Imagine, if you will, a medieval tavern, low ceilings browned with years of wood smoke, tables sticky with spilled ale and whispered gossip, a crowded bench warmed by cloaks and elbows. There's a hearth in the corner spitting firelight into the room like it owes something. And next to the fireplace, standing proud and slightly off-center, is a turnspit dog. Oh yes, a dog, in a wheel, turning the meat. This shaggy participant in kitchen labor was not a folktale or a novelty act. It was an actual breed, specifically bred to trot endlessly inside a hamster wheel-like contraption connected to a spit. As the dog ran, the spit turned, and dinner slowly roasted to golden completion, somewhere between a kitchen appliance and a slightly unwilling sous chef. While strange to modern sensibilities, the turnspit dog was a fixture of many large households from the 16th to 19th centuries. Their little paws carried a rather heavy culinary burden. And before you worry too much, yes, they were usually given scraps, although probably not the choicest cuts of lamb they so diligently rotated. Now this peculiar image, an exhausted hound providing rotisserie service, may feel far removed from modern-day food prep. But have you ever been to a backyard barbecue where one friend is always stationed next to the grill, flipping burgers with a spatula like a weary sentinel? That's your turnspit equivalent. We don't call them dogs, but in some households they still fetch beer. Let's linger here in the medieval kitchen, a place rarely romantic, always aromatic, and not often what we might call clean. Though the cooks aimed for flavour, hygiene was more of a casual acquaintance than a dear friend. Meatballs, for instance, were sometimes flavoured with what was kindly referred to as ambiguous powder, which could range from cinnamon and clove to whatever fell into the spice box that week. And taste wasn't always the priority, it was shelf life. Let's talk about pies, not the flaky, delicate dish delivered lovingly by grandmothers with lattice tops and berry stains. Oh no. Medieval pies were more like meat sarcophagi. Their crusts were known as coffins, an old word for box or case, and they were almost inedible, thick, tough, and more like a suitcase made of flour and water than anything you'd pair with vanilla ice cream. These dense pastry prisons weren't meant for eating. They were preservation tools. Meat was stuffed inside and sealed in so tightly that its cries for help were only audible to the family cat. Once baked, the crust kept the meat secure, unspoiled, and, crucially, protected from rats. Medieval pie, dinner and Tupperware, all in one mysterious vessel. Yet the echoes of this culinary habit lurch through time right into our holiday buffets. Consider the modern meat pie, or even the humble pot pie from the freezer aisle. True, no one's eating coffin crust anymore, but we're still boxing our meat in pastoral pastry cages as if deep down we remember a time when rats, dust, and curious turnspit dogs were real threats to Tuesday's leftovers. Now shift your gaze from plate to table and look at the people feasting. Noble or peasant, they would have eaten with their hands. Cutlery was uncommon at meals, particularly forks, which were eyed with suspicion when first introduced. Some even claimed that using a fork was blasphemous. Why would God give you fingers if he expected you to poke your pork with metal? In fact, an early Italian bishop once condemned the fork outright, calling it an insult to God's design. Perhaps he simply preferred to spear his pasta with conviction instead of cutlery. It wasn't until the 17th century that forks, generally two-pronged at first, began sneaking their way into common European dining. And today, some people still eat pizza with bare hands and look sideways at anyone daring to use a knife. Old traditions die gently, sometimes just evolving into Friday night rituals. Even our modern etiquette has roots in medieval mess. Ever heard of the phrase upper crust? In the days of those aforementioned coffin pies, the top layer was sometimes thought to be more refined, untouched by meat juices, and thus a bit posher. It was often reserved for guests or the host, offering them a slightly cleaner carbohydrate. Thus, upper crust became shorthand for class, even if all they were getting was half-burnt pastry and a side of existential dread. So if you bite into a sandwich and the bread seems oddly chewy, or if your utensils seem to vanish at a party, blame history. Blame the turnspit dog, the coffin pie, and the prejudiced bishops thwarting the early progress of forks. Still, for all its culinary eccentricities, the medieval dining room gave us more than indigestion and folklore. It gave us the roots of our rituals, the start of our strange table habits, and just maybe, the inexplicable need to guard the grill at every BBQ. Somewhere that spirit of the turnspit dog lives on, as a hungry uncle in Crocs, flipping kebabs by moonlight. But of course, not all food was roasted, wrapped in pastry, or frowned upon by bishops. Some required far more social drama, like communal stews, with more than just a hint of mystery, or fermented delicacies that still haunt our palates through the aisles of trendy grocery stores. And for that, we must look deeper into the pot. By the flickering light of a tallow candle, a sight and scent that would have made any medieval villager feel right at home, we now find ourselves quietly meandering into one of the slipperiest corners of medieval dining, the world of sauces, stews, and the highly suspicious art of liquid camouflage. You see, while modern chefs reach for salt and Instagram filters, medieval cooks had other ideas. Picture a long wooden table in a smoky, timbered hall. There's a roast peacock on the platter, not roasted and served, mind you, but redressed in its own resplendent feathers after cooking, as if it had just flown in, mildly inconvenienced by the oven. But beside it, or rather smothering it, would be the culinary equivalent of a sorcerer's robe, a heavily spiced, mysterious medieval sauce with as many ingredients as unanswered questions. The thing about sauces in the Middle Ages is that they weren't always meant to complement the flavor as much as cover it, especially when said flavor had developed a bit too much personality over time. In an age where refrigeration was just a dream no one knew they had, meat could get testy. So what did our determined ancestors do? They turned to the mighty spice rack. Well, technically, the spice chest, locked tighter than a noblewoman's chastity belt. Spices in the medieval world were ludicrously valuable. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, mace, all shipped from halfway across the known world, traded for silks, secrets, or a regrettable cousin's marriage contract. They were so costly that to season heavily was also to flex heavily. Nobles weren't just trying to mask the meat's sketchy past, they were showing off. It's a little like putting truffle oil on gas station jerky. Technically possible, but possibly alarming. Take, for instance, the infamous green sauce, a lumpen concoction of herbs, breadcrumbs, vinegar, and enough pepper to make a sneeze echo through the ages. or sauce cameline, an odd favourite made from breadcrumbs, wine, cinnamon and ginger, often served with fish. Because what could go wrong when you pair a tart, cinnamony sludge with trout? Now here's the quietly delightful secret. Some of our modern condiments are faint echoes of these medieval cover-ups. Ketchup's ancestor, for example, wasn't tomato-based at all. In fact, it came from fermented fish sauce in Asia. By the time it meandered over to England, it matched the spirit, if not the smell, of medieval cookcraft, a salty, umami-packed potion to drown dinner's more dubious notes. And look no further than mustard. Oh yes, spicy, resolute mustard, still gracing modern hot dogs with the silent authority of centuries past. In medieval times, mustard was everywhere. Thick, pungent, possibly weaponized. Monasteries made their own special blends, and it was one of the few condiments that required neither wealth nor a master navigator to obtain. So it was democratic in its deployment, smeared with equal vigor by peasants and princes alike. Meanwhile, back in the manor houses, someone had just invented the blank culinary canvas, pottage. Neither soup nor stew, pottage was the slow cooker before the slow cooker. Any ingredient, be it barley, beans, bones, or that suspicious chunk of last week, could be tossed in and whispered over by the cook. The longer it simmered, the less you questioned what had fallen in. Like a potluck that went existential. You still see echoes of this in modern comfort food. Think of chili, stew, even that leftovers casserole your eccentric aunt insists on making every week. There's a magic in making mystery taste marvellous, and medieval cooks were quietly expert at this culinary sleight of hand. Of course, not everything made it to modern day intact. Sauce like garum, a fermented fish sauce enjoyed enthusiastically by the Romans and eked into medieval cuisine in pockets, has mostly vanished in favour of less exciting liquids. Though it would seem the modern culinary world, in a twist of historical nostalgia, is inviting fermentation back in vogue. Kimchi, kombucha, that jar in the back of your fridge, that's become a science project. So tonight, as the fire crackles and the imaginary scent of cinnamon-laced lamb hovers comfortably in the story's air, remember that your fridge might be full, but history's pantry is absolutely brimming, spiced, stewed, and generously spooned over even the most questionable morsel. Let us now slip quietly from the kitchens and hallways of old, winding deeper into the peculiar banquets of yore, where meals weren't only eaten, but performed. Imagine, if you will, a lavish medieval feast lit by the golden flicker of tallow candles, their wax puddling like sleepy stars across long wooden tables. The scent of roasted meats, heavy spices and bread thick enough to be weaponized drifts through the hall as servants shuffle by, their hands trembling under the weight of trenchers piled high with steaming mystery. Everyone is merry, toasting with their watered ale, and nibbling gingerly at something that once had feathers, or perhaps hooves. Unclear. Now, listen closely. Among the clinks of pewter goblets and the murmurs of mild indigestion, there's a quiet, recurring sound, a sort of dull thud. That, dear dreamer, is the unmistakable noise of someone hurling meat bones directly onto the rushes on the floor, not into a bin, not onto a side plate, onto the floor. Ah yes, the rushes. You see, the floors of medieval halls were often strewn with dried plant material, commonly sedges, straw and rushes, as a sort of, well, medieval carpet meets trash can hybrid. Think of them as nature's attempt at linoleum, if linoleum also doubled as an all-you-can-dump buffet for dogs, rats, and the occasional plague-bearing flea. and into these verdant floor mats went everything. Bones, crusty bits of bread, fish heads, chicken feet, and a suspicious number of eel skins. After a good week or two, the layers began to blend into each other, a stratified record of meals passed, like an archaeological lasagna of regret. Court scribes of the time don't often mention the smell, but one imagines it was somewhere between damp monastery and forgotten cheese. And yet, for all their soggy, crumb-filled weirdness, rushes played an essential role. In fact, they were swapped out occasionally, sometimes even, hold onto your codpiece, seasonally. Summer rushes were said to be finer, while winter ones had a more robust texture, which is the sort of thing believers in artisanal oatmeal say about cardboard. But here's the oddest bit. The modern equivalent of this chaotic floor etiquette still lingers. When we toss bones into a napkin at a picnic, or swipe crumbs off the table with the insistent flourish of someone reenacting a duel, we echo a time when the floor was both dining companion and organic wastebasket. Some fast food joints even encourage just toss your scraps in the bin, which, in medieval times, would have meant lifting the hem of your tunic and kicking it into the straw. Now, not everyone embraced this floor-based compost philosophy. By the late Middle Ages, some noble households attempted refinement. They placed cloths beneath the feast tables to catch the worst of the slop, a sort of edible safety net. And in select places, remarkably ahead of their time, people began using plates. Not the gold-leafed porcelain kind, no. These were tough, dry slices of old bread called trenchers, some edible, some purely structural. Guests of higher status got the fresher bread trenchers, which could be nibbled after use. Lower-ranking diners received the tougher, week-old slabs that likely had the chewability of roofing shingles. And yet, even the humble trencher was frequently tossed to dogs, beggars, or the floor. The medieval hierarchy of leftovers and their many designated graveyards was surprisingly complex. Now, travellers of our sleepy tale, there's also the matter of table manners, or more precisely, the absolute lack thereof. In most households, it was customary, nay expected, that one would arrive at the table having cleaned only the fingertips, a token effort. Napkins were largely unknown. So was the concept of synchronized chewing or refraining from belching your approval of the beef patties. Still, people were not above correcting behavior. There are 13th century books written specifically to instruct children on table etiquette. Gems of advice include: do not clean your teeth with your knife, and do not warm your meaty hands beneath your neighbor's cloak. Both good rules, surely, though I suspect the second one has far too many modern equivalents at awkward office parties. Perhaps the clearest thread between their habits and ours is the solitary, judgment-free joy of midnight snacking. Historical records show that once the candlelight faded and the feasting ended, more than a few sneaky nobles took a candied almond or two to bed, a soft, rustling ritual still dearly beloved by anyone who's ever been caught sleeping next to a tucked-away chocolate wrapper. And on that note, with our minds tiptoeing through crumbs of the past, let's gently follow the scent of cinnamon and scandal into softer culinary legends yet to unfold. In the kitchens of high medieval households, which smelled like a curious mixture of roasted pigeons, damp stones, and slightly scorched hope, one peculiar item could always be found on the massive wooden tables before a feast: bread. But not bread as we know it today, a warm, fluffy companion to soups and sandwiches, but rather something dense, crusty, and unmistakably weaponizable. Behold, the trencher. A trencher was not only your plate, it was your occasional napkin, your reluctant dessert, and if times were especially bleak, your unfortunate dinner. Carved from coarse, stale bread, these proto-dinnerware slabs soaked up the juices of whatever had been plopped atop them. Thick stews, fatty meats, the dribbles of gravies whose ingredients we best not explore at this hour. By the time the meal ended, your trencher had absorbed enough of dinner's memory to be considered a dish of its own. You could eat it yourself, hand it down to someone less fortunate, or dramatically toss it to the hounds under the table in case you were practicing aristocratic flair. The idea of utensils being optional accessories only grew muddier. In medieval times, the noble and the peasant alike preferred the tactile intimacy of using fingers for eating. Not just fingers, but very specific fingers, commonly the thumb, index and middle, which led to elaborate post-meal rituals of hand-washing, scented waters, and a degree of courtly wiping that frankly deserves a musical number of its own. Forks, now commonplace and politely gripped by millions at brunches each Sunday, were once viewed with great suspicion. Introduced to Europe through Byzantium, the fork was sniffed at by clerics who found the tool unnatural, even sinful. One influential 11th century theologian suggested that God, having provided fingers, surely saw no need for metal prongs, until stern mothers and the dangers of hot gravy proved otherwise. Now picture the grand hall of a medieval feast, candles flickering, minstrels half-heartedly plucking lutes in the corner, the air rich with the promise of overcooked poultry. Someone, somewhere, was chewing something ancient and questionable. And yet, amidst this reek of herbs and ambition, you might notice something oddly familiar, a custom that has followed our plates into the present day: food as a display of wealth. In the Middle Ages, conspicuous consumption wasn't just a personality trait, it was a culinary mission. Gilded roasted peacocks were brought to the table with their feathers reassembled post-roasting, as if no one would notice that the bird was both flambéed and flightless. Pastries were shaped into castles. Entire fish were dyed bright colors using dangerously enthusiastic spices. Frankly, every dish looked like it had entered an argument with a painter and lost. To dine well was to live well, or at least make others think you did. And the ultimate prize? Sugar, shaped like sculptures, piled into pyramids, and sometimes just eaten in crunchy disregard to modern dentistry. Sugar was as prized as gold and handled with comparable reverence, as well as psychological denial. Fast forward to today, and food as a performance remains with us. Only now, it's curated through overhead lighting and filtered brunch photos. But the impulse to impress with the edible, to architectively assemble a dish that says, "I am thriving," persists. The medieval noble parades their glistening sauced swan. We, our artisanal avocado toast. Even the modern idea of a course originates here. Meals systematically unfolded in stages, not merely for digestion, but for status. Soups cleared the throat. Roasts displayed the estate's bounty, and desserts signaled such extreme wealth that sweetness could be spared for whimsy. It was a choreography of food, timed and tasted in sequence, with long pauses between each section for showcasing robes and pontificating about turnip yields. Of course, not everyone had the luxury of culinary theatrics. Lower classes took their stews seriously, their ale watered, and their turnips. Well, frequently. But even in humbler kitchens, traditions took root. Like simmering pots kept continuously on the fire for days, each mealtime offering subtly new surprises based on what had fallen in since Tuesday. Not quite leftovers, not quite new. A medieval mystery broth. So, Next time you tear into a baguette that could double as home defense, Instagram your meticulously ironic charcuterie board, or politely chase peas around your plate with a stainless steel fork. Pause for a moment to appreciate the past lives your meal echoes. With our fingers freshly wiped on history's linen napkin, perhaps it's time to sniff out one of the more peculiar leftover ingredients in our modern pantry. One that, shall we say, still clings to its medieval origins a little more than we might prefer. Imagine treading through the clattering dining halls of a 13th century English manor, the air thick with roast meats, burning tallow, and the philosophical resignation that hygiene is frankly optional. The long trestle tables are filled with noble guests, servants bustling to keep trenchers full and goblets brimming. Amid the candlelit chaos, one custom stands out, not for its glamour, heavens no, but for its quiet and enduring eccentricity. The medieval obsession with spices, not flavor, mind you, not in the way you or I might pine for a sumptuous curry or a spicy taco. No, this was more of a medieval spice flex, a status symbol in powdered form. Pepper, that was currency, literally. Ransoms were paid in peppercorns, ginger and cinnamon. Exotic tokens of unreachable lands, carried thousands of miles by merchants brave or foolhardy enough to confront bandits, shipwrecks, and, perhaps scariest of all, the customs officer. Monarchs and merchants alike hoarded saffron and clove not necessarily for their taste, but because their presence on a roast goose screamed, "Look at me, I have connections in Constantinople." This was culinary couture, the Louis Vuitton of seasoning, if you will. But let's pause here, because the real paradox wasn't that people loved the flavor. Sometimes they didn't even eat the food they spiced. Dishes were prepared purely for show, displays at banquets to impress guests. A congealed porridge of fish, raisins, cinnamon, and sugar might arrive at the center of the feast. A glistening, gelatinous lump dressed in edible gold leaf. No one touched it. It simply existed to bear witness to the host's affluence and to unnervingly quiver under the drafty rafters. And if you're wondering whether food actually tasted good, do keep in mind that medieval cooks were often tasked with making rotting meat palatable. Here enters our spicy hero cloves, galloping in like an aromatherapist on a rescue mission. Spices were often heavy-handed, not for flavor, but for camouflage, masking the occasional tang of, shall we say, medieval vintage duck. But what's truly haunting about this culinary antiquity is how it lingers with us even today. Let's start with pumpkin spice. Now don't panic. I know that whispering pumpkin spice too late at night can summon 14 Etsy witches and a particularly spirited barista, but the point stands. That heady 1-2 punch of nutmeg and cinnamon has medieval aristocracy written all over it. The early cookbooks of Europe, those who could afford to write such things, are positively drenched in its forerunners. Sugar and spice weren't just used in desserts. Medieval chefs tossed sweet and spicy combinations into everything. Meats, fish, pies, and beverages. The notion that sugar and cinnamon strictly belong to breakfast pastries. That culinary tidiness is a modern invention. Your chicken paprikash owes a nod of gratitude to an era when meats were routinely soaked in honey and saffron, then eaten with a facial expression best described as, "It's fine, just chew faster." There were also, strange as it may seem beneath our modern refrigerators and digital cooking apps, spice jars so cherished they came with locks. Yes, personal spice chests with literal locks and keys. Some lords wouldn't have trusted their mother with their cloves. These were nested boxes, ornate and marvelous, designed to guard ginger, Imagine creating a family heirloom to protect poultry seasoning. But this makes sense because spices were traded over immense distances. Each grain of peppercorn had sailed the seas, survived riots in Venetian ports, and been smuggled past tax-averse dukes. And by the time it arrived at your table in France or Germany, it had the same cultural cachet as a Bentley parked outside a mud and wattle hut. And in another moment of culinary déjà vu, we find the medieval precursor to our modern obsession with food pictures. Food made not just for the eating, but the spectacle. Cooks might reconstruct entire animals, feathers reapplied to roasted birds, pies filled with live songbirds. Yes, those nursery rhymes didn't come from thin air. Or jellies so ornately sculpted they looked more like edible architecture than anything you'd want to bite into. All of which points to a persistent truth. Food, for all its nourishing intentions, has always been tied up with theatre. Whether you're a banquet guest sighing over an elaborate peacock stuffed with spicy porridge, or a modern influencer posting a turmeric latte at golden hour, you're participating in an ancient pageant of food as identity, food as expression, food as mild, edible brag. And so, from peppercorn ransoms to cinnamon-flavoured chicken, from locked spice closets to golden goose soufflés, it's clear that medieval spice culture never left us. It simply traded castles for cafes and trenches for takeout boxes. Next, let's take your sleepy senses somewhere a little crunchier, into the curious bite of hard medieval breads and why they might be to blame for your aunt's obsession with biscotti. In the drowsy wake of a second sundown and one too many pints of something fermented, medieval folks often gathered, not around a fridge, of course, but around the next best thing, a slowly rotting wooden table and a communal sense of culinary confusion. It's here, in the flickering glow of sputtering tallow candles, that we find one of the most enduring, mildly unfortunate food habits of the medieval world, the mysterious, mighty, and often misshapen ritual of overcooking everything. Ah yes, the beloved boil. If meat in the Middle Ages had a zodiac sign, it was definitely Pisces, because it spent most of its afterlife submerged in water too hot for comfort. Boiling was the Beyoncé of preparation methods, the main act, the headliner, the dish that never stopped performing. And it wasn't only meat, vegetables, grains, bread crust. Essentially anything edible or questionably edible was dunked into pots and stewed within an inch of molecular collapse. Now, before we modern types start judging from our climate-controlled kitchens with our Himalayan salt and air fryer smugness, let's consider the context. Medieval kitchens weren't exactly the garden of Epicurean delights. Refrigeration was a whisper in the future's imagination, and spices were so precious that people literally locked them in tiny chests, like fragrant, overpriced pirate booty. And so, boiling became both cooking and preserving. It killed the bacteria, masked the spoilage, and in some cases, rendered the unidentifiable slightly less terrifying. Take, for instance, the classic medieval delicacy known as pottage, a kind of never-ending soup, or, perhaps more accurately, edible time travel. This was the dish that never died. People would add to it daily, tossing in barley, beans, yesterday's onion, meat if they had it, and sometimes, depending on the mood, parsnips that looked like they'd seen too much. One account describes a cook who kept the same pot of pottage going for months, like a simmering cauldron of genealogy, each bite a timeline of dinners past. But worry not, it wasn't all beige mush and broth that bit back. Boiled food took on ceremonial status too, especially in large feasts. To be handed a boiled capon, for example, was to know one's rank wasn't entirely embarrassing. The meat was soft, tender, and predictably bland, a perfect match for medieval dental standards, which were, let us say, relaxed. In fact, this instinct to soften food as much as humanly possible still echoes today in our own sleepy comfort zones. Oatmeal, mashed potatoes, mac and cheese. Centuries of soft-textured foods passed down like edible lullabies. What is applesauce but a boiled apple that went through a food processor time machine? Even your grandma's chicken noodle soup has medieval DNA, if you tilt your head and squint. Of course, the real obsession came not just from safety or scarcity, but from medieval medicine. Here comes the truly cozy part, if you're into 14th century pseudoscience. The good folks of the Middle Ages were big believers in the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. These weren't just odd terms you'd rather avoid on a first date. They governed everything, including what went on your plate. Boiling food was thought to keep things balanced, and your bodily bile levels appropriately demure. Roasted meat, possibly too hot and dry. It might anger your inner choleric. But boiled leeks, a gentle, moist remedy to soothe your melancholic tendencies. It all made perfect sense. If your medical textbooks were written by ancient Greek philosophers and edited by a disgruntled pigeon. So many of us still fall into this cozy pattern unknowingly. Think of that peaceful bowl of chicken stew in winter, steam curling like a medieval lullaby, or the way we slurp ramen to quiet the chaos of the world. Even instant noodles, those humble squiggles in hot water, are just futuristic pottage in disguise. We boil because it feels safe, because it's forgiving, because most importantly, it's easy to do when you're half asleep. Some food habits evolve by taste, others by necessity. But medieval boiling wasn't just about stopping food from trying to stand back up. It was about harmony, fortune, and the hope that your next meal wouldn't offend your spleen. And as the coals die low beneath another imagined iron pot, the sleepy hum of yesterday's stew drifting into the warm evening air, we're left with a gently bubbling question about what came next. Something just beneath the surface, soft, simmered, and oddly spicy. There is, perhaps, nothing quite so medieval, and yet eerily present in the modern world, as our uneasy relationship with table manners. You're very likely familiar with the idea that manners maketh the man, but in the 12th century, they also help prevent the man from contracting dysentery from his neighbour's fingers. Let's drift gently to an early morning in the great hall of a minor noble, somewhere in the less muddy part of England. So, very few options. The household is preparing for breakfast, though back then, breakfast was more like a legal obligation to stop fainting. It was often a sparse affair, unless one was ill, or a small child, or simply French. No forks, of course. The fork, when it first made its dainty appearance at European tables, was accused of being unnaturally pronged. The devil's tines, they said. Too sharp, too dainty, too suspiciously effective. Why use a tiny pitchfork to deliver food, when you could instead just lunge at communal trenches with 5 of your God-given digits? Ah yes, trenchers. Possibly one of humanity's most edible mistakes. These were slabs of yesterday's bread, hardened into starchy roof tiles, upon which generous mounds of sauce-heavy meats were dumped. The juice would slowly soak the trenchers over the course of the meal, until the bread was more gravy than grain. You could eat it if you were particularly enthusiastic, or it might be collected and distributed to the poor at the gate, unwitting donors to what we now call leftovers. But the heart of the discomfort wasn't the bread, it was the proximity. dining was a contact sport. Tables were long and elbows were sharp. One might share not only a trencher, but a cup, a spoon, or an unsettling awareness of one's neighbor's chewing technique. Napkins, as a concept, existed, but motions such as wiping one's beard on the tablecloth or one's mouth on one's sleeve were still widely acceptable. For a select few, the rule of thumb was, if the table is large enough to have a cloth, then surely it was large enough to clean your face with. Now, the peculiar medieval habit that lingers like a garlic-heavy sauce through time is this: the insistence on hands as the primary utensil, despite sophisticated alternatives being available. Today, we celebrate this in the form of fried chicken joints and taquerias. We provide cutlery, of course, but in hushed tones. We love eating with our fingers. It wakes up the ancient part of the soul that once wrestled boar ribs near a drafty hearth, possibly while discussing theology. Hand-washing before meals. Optional, often religious. Soap was rare and suspiciously French. Often, guests would be presented with a basin and towel, which were meant to promote cleanliness, but mostly provided an opportunity for very splashy performances. Washing hands before eating was a sign of class. But let's not forget, so was bathing only twice a year. And then, the medieval fascination with presentation. Dishes shaped like castles, pies with live birds inside, roasted peacocks redressed in their own feathers, in a sort of culinary revenge fashion show. All to impress, to beguile, to share a tale through supper. It's no accident that modern tasting menus still perform this pageantry. Lo, the quenelle, virtue of form over hunger, and the foam, that baffling spirit of soup. But the original goal was not flavor. It was status. To show that you could afford sugar or saffron, or an entire pig sculpted to look like something inexplicably horrifying, like a fish with wings. If it was confusing to the eye and hard on the stomach, it was probably expensive. Much like modern art. Somewhere deep in our modern dinner parties, charcuterie boards whisper of these bygone days. Carefully layered meats, decorative cheeses in geometrical purgatory, all consumed with fingers, standing up, while socially pretending we've always done this. And then there's the confession of everyone's favorite feast day struggle, the host who insists that guests must keep eating, even past the borders of biological possibility, a truly medieval generosity. In the noble courts, refusing offered food could be seen as deeply insulting. One had to invent elaborate excuses, feigning ailments or bad omens from the stars. But even then, the goose might still find its way onto your trencher through sheer persistence. Now, imagine slipping from this great hall, the torches dimming and last bites taken, leaving behind echoes of belly laughter and very greasy fingers. Out past the steamy kitchens and into the cool, damp air of the courtyard. The moon swings slowly overhead as we move toward a curiosity even more peculiar. The medieval diet fads and pleasant poisons they embraced in the name of good health. By moonlight in a medieval hall, draughty, echoey, and thoroughly oaken, you might have spied a curious ritual unfolding at the supper table. Not a chant or a summoning, mind you, but something arguably stranger. A nobleman daintily dabbing his lips with what appeared to be yesterday's tablecloth. Ah, the medieval napkin. Actually, not quite a napkin at all. You see, in the days before folded linen flowers sat poised atop dinner plates like botanical origami, the business of wiping one's mouth was handled rather more communally and less delicately. Tablecloths often ran the entire length of the feasting board, and it was perfectly acceptable, nay, expected. for one to lean over and give the edge of it a good, hearty swipe. In some cases, a long cloth called a trencher cloth was draped just for this purpose. Think of it as the 14th century version of paper towels. If paper towels were made of wool and shared by 20 people who'd just eaten a roasted duck with their hands. Forks, by the way, hadn't quite established dominion over medieval cutlery, especially in Northern Europe. The dagger, naturally, enjoyed pride of place, was multifunctional, good for slicing meat, scaring your enemies, and picking your teeth afterward, all in that order. For many medieval diners, hands were still the utensils of choice, and boy, did those hands get busy. Which means the so-called napkin, or the communal tablecloth, or your sleeve, or your neighbour's sleeve if you weren't particularly well bred, was in almost constant use. The concept of washing one's hands before dinner existed, certainly. Lords and ladies performed a little ritual, where scented water was poured over their fingers into a basin. It seems very hygienic until you remember that it was mostly symbolic, just a splash or two to prove you're refined, not an actual scrub down. There were no soap dispensers or foaming lathers, no citrus-scented antibacterial anything, and yet, somehow, these people were perfectly content to tear into greasy meats, smear puddings on their tunics, and then reach across the table for more, all the while depending on a single long cloth, or occasionally a small dog, to do the post-snack cleanup. Yes, lapdogs were a thing at medieval meals, not just because they were cute and barked at ghosts, but because they also doubled as edible napkins. Sometimes, after a meal, nobles would let their dogs lick clean their hands. It was seen as a quaint and adorable method of tidying up. Today, such behavior earns you a raised eyebrow and an unsolicited lecture from a passing nutritionist. Of course, if you weren't noble, your options were even more organic. Common folk didn't have tablecloths, or trenches, or, let's be honest, tables. Meals were often taken on a bench, or around a rough wooden board that doubled as a work surface. Napkins? Probably a patch of nearby grass, or a corner of tunic that already bore the stains of 3 previous meals. It wasn't gross, it was efficient. So how does this all still cling to us, like grease on a goblet? Well, fast food isn't just modern. Convenience, it's a conceptual throwback. Eating with your hands, soaking up flavors with bread, wiping your face on a stack of available tissues all while seated, elbow to elbow, with strangers in a public place? That's a medieval inn, my dear sleepy listener, just with more fluorescent lighting. And then there's the formal dinner napkin, a strange piece of folded fabric no one's quite sure how to use. Are you meant to lay it in your lap, dab your mouth, tuck it into your collar like a rogue knight, perhaps swanfold it mid-meal to impress that cousin who majored in hospitality? We all pretend to know, but truly, napkin etiquette has always been a blur of vaguely remembered rules and last-minute improvisation, exactly as it was hundreds of years ago with the tablecloth. Even the phrase breaking bread has deeply medieval roots. Back then, bread wasn't just food, it was infrastructure. Thick slabs of stale bread, called trenchers, served as edible plates. Once, they'd soaked up all the meaty goo and noble gravy. They could be eaten, gifted to the poor, or, in case of extraordinary filth, hurled at jesters. The modern dinner roll doesn't quite carry the same gravitas, but the ritual remains. Bread first, always. A tiny signal that the feast, or the microwave dinner, is about to begin. It's funny, isn't it? The way remnants of 1,000-year-old customs sneak their aproned way into our daily routines. We offer the bread basket. We vaguely patted our mouths with a triangle of white cotton. We eat with hands at county fairs and politely ignore the part where we still, sometimes, lick our fingers. And just as these sleepy layers of the past settle around your thoughts like a warm tunic layered over a linen shift, let's drift even deeper into the curious world of what they used to drink alongside such meals. Because water, surprisingly, wasn't always welcome at the table. Somewhere between the first trickle of twilight and the scent of warm bread from a distant kitchen, let us tiptoe into one of the more quietly enduring culinary customs birthed in the Middle Ages: eating without individual tableware. Nowadays, we clutch our forks like tiny metal pitchforks, spearing broccoli into submission, and wield knives with the confidence of a sous chef from a cooking competition who hasn't yet cried. But medieval diners, well, their relationship with utensils was casual at best. To understand the medieval disdain for cutlery, one must imagine a grand feasting hall lit by flickering torches and a hearth big enough to qualify as a guest bedroom. Long wooden tables are piled high with roasted meats, pies heavy as bricks, and stew with the soul of 1,000 onions. Now, here's the twist. Beside each trencher, a sort of edible plate made from stale bread. There is no fork. There may be a knife, if you brought your own, and perhaps a spoon, but that would make you quite posh indeed. The common approach was this: God gave you fingers, so use them. This is truly finger food at its most elemental. But it wasn't just about convenience or culinary rebellion. There was a startling amount of etiquette governed by this handsy method. Washing your hands before eating wasn't merely a polite suggestion. It was considered a moral obligation. In fact, some medieval texts insist that one should wash hands all the way up to the elbow before touching food. Quite theatrical, really. Ideal for dramatic entrances to banquets. Dining decorum also dictated which fingers were allowed to touch which food, displaying too many food-slick fingers simultaneously. Scandalous. Ideally, one used only 3 fingers, sort of like conducting a roast beef sonata with a meat baton. The absence of cutlery also meant meals were unabashedly communal. One trencher might serve 2 people, meaning you not only shared bread and broth, but also germs, gossip, and breadcrumbs. While modern diners may raise an eyebrow at double-dipping, medieval folk shared everything without much fuss. After all, boiling most things took care of the pathogens, and trust was forged over mutton grease. But the most delightfully strange aspect was the way people would use their own personal knives, carried everywhere like medieval Swiss army utensils. These knives weren't just for carving roast goose. They were status symbols, ornate handles, engraved blades. If your knife said nothing about who you were you even truly feasting? Still, the noble fork, so common today it hides in every office breakroom drawer, had a much slower start. Europeans viewed it with deep suspicion. Some clergy insisted the fork was an affront to God's natural design. One Byzantine princess, Maria Argyropoulina, who dared to use golden forks during a Venetian banquet, was condemned for vanity and later died of a mysterious illness. Rumored divine consequences of her 2-pronged arrogance. No one wanted to end up like Maria, so forks were largely banished for centuries. Why orchestrate your own divine smiting when you could simply scoop food up with a torn-off bit of bread and call it a day? And speaking of bread, we simply must whisper a brief word about trenchers. These thick, dry slices of yesterday's loaves weren't just edible plates. They were expressions of charity. Once soaked through with stew and gravy, they were collected and given to the poor or if particularly saturated, tossed to the dogs. This was considered both generous and hygienic. It doesn't bear asking whose trenchers fed whom. Oddly enough, some of these customs echo through our present-day rituals. The hamburger, taco, sandwich, all modern trenchers in disguise, serving platters designed for sharing, dishes meant to be eaten by hand, even in polite company. The ghost of the medieval banquet haunts your Super Bowl party, softly, with mayonnaise. So if ever you feel judged for eating fries with your hands or sneaking a chicken wing sans fork, simply whisper, "It's historically authentic." Then wash your hands, elbow to fingertip. As the torches fade and the trencher crumbs settle, let us wander further into murky mazes of food history. Soon, a spice ship will drift quietly into our sleepy harbour, and with it, tales of cinnamon, pepper, and medieval cravings that sailed the globe, sometimes badly. It's hard to imagine anyone today slipping a peacock feather into their casserole and calling it dinner. But in the Middle Ages, flamboyance at the table was less about flavour and more about theatrical flair. You see, long before the era of Instagrammable brunches, medieval banquets were their own kind of edible exhibition, equal parts nourishment and absurd social signalling. Take, for instance, the medieval delicacy known as cockentrice, described best as cuisine gone rogue. A cockentrice was what happened when a noble chef decided that one animal simply wasn't enough. It involved sawing a pig and a bird, often a capon or a chicken, in half and sewing the front end of one beast to the rear of the other. Then it was roasted. The end product looked like something out of a dragon tamer's fever dream, only somehow more edible and likely seasoned with the tears of kitchen apprentices. Now, this stitched together spectacle wasn't about taste, of course. It was a performance, a flex, a strange protein-laced status update before status updates were digital. Today, maybe we post our farm-to-table ravioli beside antique flatware under soft lighting. But in the 1400s, you rolled out your cockentrice and nodded smugly, while a minstrel played funky lute music in awe. And speaking of status symbols disguised as food, prepare your palate for the subtleties of medieval sugar art. Far from the humble spoonful in your morning coffee, sugar in the Middle Ages was as precious as gold dust, with an identity crisis. Confected into fantastical sculptures called subtleties, sugar was moulded into forms both whimsical and wildly impractical. Castles, mythical beasts, birds in mid-flight, all there on your dining table, daring anyone to eat them, or even understand their purpose. Were they art? Were they dessert? Were they edible threats? And yet, we mustn't scoff too hard. We haven't outgrown these impulses. Think of the modern wedding cake. A three-tiered sugar monolith made to be admired, nervously sliced, and partially eaten before being tucked uneasily into someone's freezer for a symbolic eternity. But back to the subtleties. These weren't merely desserts. They were narrative devices. At a royal event, the sugar display might tell a story. A knight rescuing a sugary damsel, a siege on a gingerbread fortress, all rendered with the help of grimacing kitchen staff and exhausted sculptors with very sticky fingers. Let's not forget the meal's musical accompaniment. Unlike today's light jazz or Spotify playlists, humming quietly behind dinner, medieval feasts had minstrels, jesters, and sometimes maniacally enthusiastic animal performances. One noble feast famously featured a trained monkey in armor, jousting with a small wooden horse. Whether this was done before or after the cheese course remains a mystery, probably best left unsolved. And yes, while we're on the subject of cheese, There is no polite segue into the lovingly pungent realm of medieval dairy. The cheese of the age wasn't just food, it was survival. Hardy wheels of fromage doubled as lunch, currency, and occasionally helmet padding. And yet, cheese was far from neutral. Its smell, texture, and origins could say much about its maker. An overly stinky wheel, peasant-made, a dainty, herb-infused wedge, fit for a bishop. Cheese had politics. In fact, a 13th century writer once complained bitterly about a wheel of cheese being used as a bribe in court, asking pointedly, what justice can be had when wheels are rolling heads in ruling matters? A fair question, though we no longer dine beneath sugar birds or fear food sown from multiple species. Echoes of medieval dining culture still slink into our modern lives. The wedding cake, the performative holiday roast, that one aunt who insists her marshmallow salad is traditional. All whispers from medieval kitchens, echoing through the electric hush of our modern refrigerators. And so, as plates are cleared in our minds and sugar castles melt back into obscurity, let us wander gently onward, where the rituals of the medieval dining room spill past the table and into the peculiar world of table manners, some of which, mysteriously, still cling to us today. While medieval cooks weren't exactly churning out Michelin-starred cuisine, they were surprisingly ambitious when it came to experimentation. And by experimentation, we mean tossing logic into the cauldron and stirring briskly. This brings us, quietly and curiously, to the tale of the humble pie, not the fruit-filled, golden-crusted kind you find cooling on windowsills in children's storybooks, but its medieval ancestor, a marvel of meat, mystery, and mild concern. You see, in the Middle Ages, pies were not primarily the delicious little dessert domes we now associate with birthdays and bad breakups. No, back then, their purpose was practical. The crust was called a coffin, quite literally, because it resembled, well, a coffin. Thick and stiff and baked, to be almost inedible. The pastry served as a container to protect the meat inside from the treacherous outside world. Rats, dirt, and possibly over-inquisitive neighbors. Meat was expensive, and people were possessive about it. If you had a goose and a garlic clove to your name, you guarded them like crown jewels. Imagine this. You wander into a feasting hall lit by torches, the air thick with the scent of smoked boar and sweat. Minstrels strum lutes somewhere in the background, and at the center of the table, a parade of pies stretches like a pastry moat. Each one is a surprise. You never quite knew what was inside. Sometimes beef, sometimes pigeon, sometimes hedgehog. Nature's pine cone with legs, surrounded by gravy. And then there were the so-called animated pies. These weren't enchanted by medieval wizards, though frankly, a bit of sorcery would have made them less alarming. These were entertainment pieces. Picture this. Some cook, probably named Reginald, spends hours baking a large hollow pie crust. Once cooled, he lifts the top and places live birds. Yes, live, feathered, squawking birds inside the shell. Then, as part of the banquet's grand performance, the pie is brought forth and ceremoniously opened. Birds fly out. Everyone claps. Nobody eats the pie. It was a dish you applauded rather than consumed. The medieval version of dinner theatre, starring pigeons. This performative approach to food had a dramatic flair, but it also underlined their understanding of taste, or rather, their complete ambivalence toward it. Seasoning was less about flavour and more about the optics of wealth. A noble table might boast dishes dusted with saffron, not because anyone liked saffron, but because it was expensive and therefore deeply impressive. "Come hither and behold my astringent golden stew," the Lord might say, as his guests politely choked it down, nodding. Preservation was also part of the puzzle. In an era with no refrigeration and a cheerful disregard for expiration dates, the trusty pie crust acted as a fortress of freshness. The dough, often made with little more than flour and water, baked into a concrete-like crust to block out air, and quite possibly make an excellent building material if things went south at the manor. Strangely enough, this culinary tradition has tiptoed its way into our modern world. The steak and kidney pies of Britain, the chicken pot pies in America, the empanadas of Latin America, all echo that ancient habit of wrapping something edible inside something questionably edible and calling it a good time. Even the tradition of eating with our eyes has its medieval streaks. Our decorative cakes and layered desserts call back to those grand gilded dishes that were designed to awe rather than nourish. They didn't just serve food, they unveiled it with flair, like a magician pulling a slightly undercooked rabbit from a hat. And every time you slide a lasagna into a casserole dish, or lovingly cover a stew with a puff pastry lid, you are, whether knowingly or not, participating in a centuries-old ritual born of practicality, showmanship, and the deep desire to hide a questionable pheasant under crust. But what lurked beneath more than just the crust? The sauces, dear listener. Thick, bright, and utterly mysterious. The next layer of medieval meals, dressed not in subtlety, but in spectacle, and the occasional fermented fish. Let's follow our sleepy breadcrumb trail to those curious sauces next. In the dusky glow of a candlelit hall, somewhere in the late 13th century, a knight sits before a wooden platter of what might charitably be described as stew. It bubbles mysteriously, its surface broken not by spoon, but by the occasional rise of some unidentifiable object. Was that a parsnip, or the sole of a shoe? Hard to say, but the knight eats it anyway, because in medieval kitchens, both were equally plausible. The thing about medieval cuisine is that it labored under a few guiding principles. 1. Food should not go to waste, even if it has technically outlived its best before century. 2. Spices equal status, and the more your dish tastes like cinnamon-infused mustard salmon on honey cabbage pie, the more likely you are to have impressed your peers. And 3. Chewing is optional, especially if things are boiled into submission. Now picture this rather robust dining scenario in contrast with something far more familiar, the modern dinner party. A small group of friends gathers to eat quinoa-stuffed bell peppers, nod solemnly over fermented anything, and argue about whose sourdough starter has achieved true sentience. You may laugh, but this too is the long shadow of medieval food culture stretching across time, like a ghost in an apron whispering, "Add more cloves." One of the most curious culinary legacies from the table of yesteryear is the concept of etiquette. Not just manners, but the orchestrated ballet of when and how to drink your soup without being banished from polite society. Back then, napkins weren't always a thing. Instead, folks practiced the noble medieval art of wipe thee fingers on the dog or use thy tablecloth as God intended. But in elite circles, dining became theatre. There were strictly assigned places at the table, not out of convenience, but because your seating determined your social ranking. The closer to the lord or lady of the manor, the more likely you'd get food that hadn't been gnawed first by someone else. A delightful honor, really. Cutlery, now so beloved by all fingers not wishing to be burned, was another slow arrival to the party. The humble fork, for example, made its European debut to widespread suspicion. At first it was seen as decadent and, gasp, unchristian, because clearly, if God had wanted you to pierce your meat with 2 prongs, he would have given you forks instead of fingers. In fact, people scoffed at the fork for centuries, until it became fashionable among Italian nobles, proving once again that food morality is often a matter of taste and linen. Ironically, while forks had to fight for respect, knives were ubiquitous, though not necessarily provided. Guests were expected to bring their own, which lent a certain edge to hosting dinners. Imagine a potluck today, where half the guests arrive brandishing personal cutlery with blades sharp enough to field dress a deer. That was just a Tuesday, back then. And then, of course, there was salt, white gold on the medieval table. It was kept in ornate containers called salt cellars and placed strategically to remind people just how far down the social ladder they were. The phrase, below the salt, comes from this tradition. If your seat was further from the salt, you were clearly not worth the good stuff. This might explain why modern restaurant goers, when confronted with under-seasoned mashed potatoes, are overcome with existential despair. Somewhere deep down, their medieval soul knows they've been cast below the salt line. Even the idea of the feast as punctuation for life's major events, weddings, births, victorious border skirmishes, or unusually plump pigs, has survived and evolved into our fondness for celebratory meals. Except now, instead of roasting an entire boar with apples in its mouth, we settle for a brunch buffet and a photo backdrop. Still, as odd as some of these customs seem, they linger like breadcrumbs scattered through the woods of modern dining. We toast. We pass dishes to the left. We pretend not to judge others' unusual pairing of ketchup and cheese. All tiny nods to a time when meals were ritual, spectacle, and occasionally a stage for passive-aggressive poisoning. But perhaps the most enduring custom of all comes not from noble banquets or spicy stews, but from the humble act of gathering together, shuffling in from fields and castles and cubicles alike to share food, swap stories, and try not to swallow a whole clove by accident. And so, as the candles burn low in that ancient hall, and the night settles back with a bellyful of mystery root casserole, we drift gently into the next curiosity. A habit so quaint, so strangely sticky with history, it still shows up in our modern kitchens. Fluttering in from the wild medieval countryside on tiny, greasy wings, in the softened hush of a candlelit evening, when the wind whispered across kitchen, shutters and the hearth's glow flickered across stone floors, something oddly unsettling was happening to cheese. Yes, cheese, that humble wedge of comfort, was enduring indignities we can scarcely imagine today. But before we spread this tale too thickly on our crackers, let's drift gently into the curious kitchens of the medieval world, where dairy dreams met their tangy, sometimes terrifying realities. In medieval Europe, cheese was not just a food, it was a science experiment left slightly too long on the windowsill. The average peasant or noble didn't have refrigerated shelves or specialty cheesecloths. Instead, they had patience, extreme room temperatures, and a certain God-given tolerance for risk. Cheese was often stored in ways we might now describe as high risk, low reward. Soft cheeses were rare because they spoiled swiftly. Harder varieties, aged in cellars often shared by pickled fish, slept next to things with legs. Legs they still used, mind you. One of the signature moves of medieval cheese culture was the inclusion of live guests. Mite-infested cheese, yes, cheese deliberately colonized by tiny, thriving, cheese-munching mites, was not only eaten but cherished. In Saxony, there was something called Milbenkäse, a specialty that involved painstakingly fermenting cheese inside a box full of cheese mites. The mites digested the rind, imbued the aroma with something euphemistically described as earthy pungency, and, over time, became part of the edible experience. Now, before you recoil, consider this. The entire community agreed upon this. Shepherds, traders, and wandering monks united in their quiet belief that cheese with crawling texture was okay, as long as you brushed a few of the livelier mites off first. This love of living cheese didn't stay isolated to the cheese board. The same appreciation for aged, fermented, and vaguely alive foods appeared again and again in the Middle Ages, and not just out of gustatory curiosity. In a time without the refrigerator's cold embrace, fermentation was a survival technique, but necessity often came dressed in rituals of taste and texture. People developed tastes for the very things they could not preserve any other way. Think of it like Stockholm Syndrome, with dairy. Now, let your thoughts melt toward the feudal pantry, where the lord of the manor might request a Gouda glazed in ashes, or a wedge of blue cheese so veined it could almost be read like a map. Molds that might send today's health inspector into an anxiety attack were seen as a mark of elegance. A blue cast, that's status. A green fuzz, why, that's flavor. And if it glowed a little, all the better, it matched the chandelier. Curiously, many of these habits haven't entirely vanished. Today we praise the funkiness of a Roquefort, the assertive tang of Limburger, the lava lamp consistency of Epoisse. Yes, these might come from spotless dairies in France or Wisconsin, but the DNA is medieval through and through. The bravado needed to enjoy a cheese that stings the nostrils, that's a muscle honed over centuries of nibbling the near inedible. Fast forward to our modern cheese plates, with their dainty triangles and fig slices. Behind every elegant drizzle of balsamic reduction is a ghostly cheesemonger from the year 1287, nodding knowingly. That same ghost is probably still slightly sticky from turning curds in a very humid room above a pigsty. And still, traditions linger. Consider how we pair cheese with wine, a practice born, in part, from necessity. In medieval times, when a cheese became too fragrant, too lively, or too suspicious, wine worked as both a flavor complement and liquid courage. Today we call it a pairing. Back then, it was more like self-defense. As the fire in the hearth hums low, and the imagined banner of a noble house gently lifts in a draught, we realize that even our most refined cheese boards are palimpsests of medieval survival strategies. There's elegance there, and just a little bit of reckless bravery. And as the wheels of history, be they Gouda, Parmesan or Cheddar, roll ever onward, our next stop is not far away. Something equally pungent, equally peculiar, waits on the other side of the pantry curtain, tucked behind earthen jars and sweet with medieval ambition. Perhaps the most underrated contributor to modern cuisine is not the Renaissance chef or the celebrity host of a Victorian cooking salon, but rather the medieval platter-laden peasant who was simply trying to survive dinner without spoiling their only pair of shoes. You see, evening meals in medieval households, highborn and muck-footed alike, were rarely composed with the luxury of ergonomics or etiquette in mind. Reality was a greasy, steaming trench of interrupted peas, overcooked root vegetables, and pots of stew so recycled that yesterday's dinner could easily be Tuesday's breakfast. But let us not judge, for nestled under these murky ladles and questionably spiced broths are habits that somehow still linger in our modern kitchens like shy phantoms strapped in aprons. Case in point, the ever-enduring medieval love affair with communal eating. Imagine this: a wooden board, hastily wiped with something that might have once been a napkin, plunked down between a gaggle of family members, knights, and the occasional freeloading monk. Upon this makeshift table sat a great trench of bland yet filling porridge-like stew, all scooping from the same vessel, armed with wooden spoons, or in poorer households, crusts of bread hardened enough to be confused with pottery shards. Fast forward to modern times, and suddenly you've got tapas restaurants, fondue parties, charcuterie boards that absolutely no one knows how to pronounce confidently. Yes, the baguette slices may be arranged in neat Fibonacci spirals now, but conceptually, you, your friend, and that stranger who's fingering the last olive are still gathered around a central edible spectacle. The medieval peasant would feel right at home, minus the wine foam. And then there's the curious ritual of flavoring absolutely everything with spices that nobody really understands. In the medieval kitchen, spice wasn't just a seasoning. It was a flamboyant status symbol, like edible silk, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg. These were drizzled, grated, or pulverized into dishes, whether they made sense or not. Want to add saffron to your fish jelly? Absolutely. Thicken a dessert with breadcrumbs and add beef stock. Go right ahead, sire. Today, foodies pepper their scrambled eggs with turmeric, sip cinnamon almond milk lattes, and call it fusion. Fashionable, yes, but deep down, it's the same culinary logic that led people in 1392 to boil eels in almond milk and then garnish the whole battlefield with raisins. We haven't abandoned the oddities. We've just switched to prettier serving bowls and Instagram filters. Oh, and don't think we've gotten away from strange mealtime multitasking. Medieval folk, especially in noble households, often turned meals into theatrical marathons. By the third course, you'd be enjoying your pickled herring to the mild accompaniment of a lute, 2 jesters, and maybe a goose in costume. Spectacle and sustenance were served on the same platter. Now, swap that with your modern dinner party. Dramatic lighting over an artisanal cheese board, with a curated Spotify playlist wafting gently through the air. Is that medieval fanfare? No, but it plays the same emotional notes. Dining, even now, is entertainment disguised as nutrition. Even modern food portioning owes a nod to long-forgotten habits. Ever noticed how we still talk about courses, starter, main, dessert? Echoing an age when dinners stretched across 5 or 6 acts, each one more lavish and curiously colder than the one before. Even etiquette manuals today still whisper the ghost of medieval mealtime. Rules, utensils placed just so, napkins folded like origami swans, forks not used to stab your older brother, at least not while company is over. So many things lurk beneath the surface of our meal rituals. The idea of breaking bread, as a symbol of friendship, for instance. In earlier centuries, guests were greeted not with handshakes, but with offerings of bread. Hard, possibly stale bread, true, but still. It was the sentiment that counted. Today, we just call this the bread basket and pretend not to judge how many rolls our companions nibble through before the appetizers arrive. And finally, the oddest tradition that time refused to fully ditch, drinking something alcoholic with every meal, including breakfast. In medieval times, this was partly for safety. Ale and mild beer were safer than potentially plague-laced water. But the habit lingered. Now, brunch is incomplete without mimosas, dinner with wine, and the occasional co-worker suggesting just one cocktail at lunch, which sounds medieval enough already. As we pull back the heavy curtain, possibly made of heirloom lettuce. On these inherited habits, it becomes clear that medieval cuisine never truly left the building. It simply dimmed the lantern, changed the tablecloth, and started charging for delivery. Just ahead, we'll amble deeper still into the twisted tunnels of historical dining oddities, where you might discover that the next thing hiding on your plate may not be food at all. There's something inherently charming, if a bit suspicious, about the fact that medieval people didn't really believe in forks. I mean, they existed, sure. The ancient Romans had something fork-like. The Byzantines certainly poked things with prongs. But by the time you got to Europe in the Middle Ages, forks were shunned like gossip at a monastery. You see, the fork was once thought to be decadent, foreign, and a little too devilish, quite literally. Pronged instruments used to skewer food might as well be Lucifer's own cutlery. And so, in great halls lit by flickering tallow and the eternal groaning of minstrels, nobles tore into roasts with fingers gloriously unencumbered by finesse. Now imagine this, a grand feast in a candle-lit castle hall, a roasted boar at the centre, its apple still mockingly intact. Dozens of guests all leaning over trenchers. Those are thick slices of day-old bread used as plates, and using their thumb and first two fingers to pick apart meat and sop up juices. The three-finger food method was ideal. The remaining two stayed clean for holy gestures, or more likely, wiping your mouth in a vaguely pious motion. It wasn't until the fork started sneaking back in through the bougie back door of trade routes that dinner manners began to evolve. The Italians, ever ahead of the culinary curve, began flirting with forks around the 12th century. One Venetian noblewoman shocked Europe by bringing golden forks to her wedding feast, and the church, clutching its collective rosary, declared it scandalous. Using a fork implied that God had erred when he designed human hands. It was, according to some clerics, an insult to the Almighty. Fast forward several centuries, and we now use forks with such nonchalance that we've practically forgotten their villain origin story. You might even have that little salad fork you're too nervous to use correctly. But rest easy. It's just a relic of medieval anxiety disguised as etiquette. On a similar note, let's have a quiet look at tablecloths. Today, they conjure images of polite tea sandwiches or grandmothers who iron with purpose. But in medieval dining, the tablecloth had a utility as comforting as it was frankly disgusting. You see, guests were expected to wipe greasy fingers, or worse, on the tablecloth. Napkins were not yet standard fare. The host would lay out a long white cloth, not as a pristine canvas, but as a merciful absorbent. So next time someone scolds you for using your sleeve, you can point out your ancestors' satin-stained legacy. And don't get me started on the crumbs. You might think use a plate is the obvious solution, but in medieval homes, the concept of an individual dish was borderline luxurious. Shared trenchers could become spongy messes by the end of the meal. If you were poor, you might get a wooden board with a whisper of bread residue on it. If you were rich, your trencher was changed mid-meal, like a fashion-forward porcupine swapping capes. Yet trapped somewhere in all this finger food chaos was a surprising streak of hospitality. People dined in hierarchical harmony. The seat next to the salt cellar was the place of honor. It meant you were trusted not to double dip or steal the salt outright, which, in fairness, was more valuable than gold in some regions. Salt was table jewelry and security deposit all in one. Poorer guests sat below the salt, quite literally. Thus began the phrase and the subtle tyranny of condiment-based class systems. Surprisingly, many of these quirks have quietly tiptoed into our modern dining habits. Family-style meals, for instance, would make a medieval lord beam with recognition. The idea of passing dishes around the table, rather than being served individually, was deeply medieval, a symbol of communal trust, shared germs, and which cousins snatched the last piece of lamb. Even the idea of breaking bread to symbolize unity was a medieval mainstay, albeit one tangled in both ritual and practicality. Bread was everywhere and touched everything. It was plate, napkin, forklift, and sometimes dessert if you added enough honey. So tonight, as you gingerly place your fork beside your dinner plate and fold your napkin into something resembling a swan or an exhausted triangle, remember, somewhere once, a noblewoman was being side-eyed by a bishop for daring to use a golden fork, and somewhere else, a peasant was delighting in a greasy trench of bread, unconcerned with manners and positively thriving. And just beyond that flickering torchlight, something even less edible was waiting to sneak its way onto our modern plates. In the flickering candlelight of a medieval hall, shadows danced on timbered beams, while trenchers of dubious stew exhaled their mysterious aroma. You might imagine these feasts were full of clinking goblets, roasted boar, and triumphant choruses of madrigal singers holding a perfect B-flat. But in truth, what slipped onto the medieval plate and into modern culture was less poetic. Take, for instance, the curious tale of banquets punctuated not by toasts, but by spontaneous bouts of hiccups, thanks to a well-documented overuse of the humblest vice, spices. Yes, spices. Aromatic powders strong enough to kick a bishop from his bench. And while today a tap of cinnamon might adorn your latte with harmless whimsy, back then, spices were a raucous form of edible ostentation. Wealthy nobles didn't just season their food, they armed it. A stew was not complete unless its singe of saffron, reeked of cloves, or was ambushed by a rogue handful of imported peppercorns. Pepper, by the way, was so precious it was accepted in payment of rent, fines, and, on more than one occasion, a second cousin's dowry. And yet, using spices wasn't really about flavor. Well, it was. But it was also a medieval performance art. You see, in an age suspicious of taste buds, and where food storage was sort of a medieval choose-your-own adventure, spices were hailed for their medicinal virtues. In that light, dusting cinnamon on your venison was less about culinary flair and more a self-diagnosed treatment for melancholy, gout, or unsolicited visits from the in-laws. These spice-heavy concoctions often arrived by way of what's best described as a nursery rhyme gone feral of a dish, the medieval meat pie. Not to be confused with the savoury, buttery pastries of modern affection, these meat pies were sturdy enough to survive a siege. Their so-called crust, or coffin, wasn't for eating at all. It was just a container. Imagine baking your dinner inside a small, edible filing cabinet, and then throwing away the cabinet. That was a normal Tuesday. Oddly enough, the pie coffin became something of a messaging system. Bakers would etch little symbols into the crust, swirls, flowers, and often enigmatic squiggles, sending the medieval equivalent of a passive-aggressive post-it note. If your crust bore an angry lion, that might be a warning. Do not eat this cold, or ever. But just when you think medieval food couldn't get more theatrical, you meet the peacock. Literally. In some feasting halls, birds like peacocks and swans were not only roasted, but redressed after cooking in their original feathers. Imagine a glistening roasted fowl, carefully stitched back into its technicolor feather coat, as if it had just wandered out of a woodland sauna. Sometimes, the beaks were gilded in real gold. You couldn't eat it, of course. The feathers were mostly for presentation, and patient guests had to peel back the glamorous plumage to reach the lukewarm, questionably cooked meat beneath. But oh, what a show! And from these opulent, plume-filled dinners came one enduring marvel that lingers even now. The centerpiece. Today's neutral-toned floral arrangement may just be a ghostly descendant of the taxidermy-infused culinary peacocks of yesteryear. Century after century, the need to impress over dinner with more than just conversation has clung tightly to our collective napkin. Whether it's the glossy turkey on a holiday table or a specially shaped cheese ball at book club, presentation remains everything. Yet, of all the medieval food habits that crept, shuffled, or feathered their way into modern kitchens, one of the strangest to survive might be stuffing. Once called farce, yes, like the genre of comedy, it was flourished into geese, hens, and things that no longer quacked with a remarkable zeal. Made of breadcrumbs, herbs, offal, and a bit of courage, the stuffing was meant to stretch a feast further, steam the interior from the inside out, and provide guests with something to talk about on the long horse ride home. Even today, we conjure stuffing for festive meals, recreate pie crusts as flaky containers for meat and memory, and sprinkle our plates with spices once worth their weight in sailors. But back then, the food may not have always tasted good, but oh, it certainly made a statement. Now, as the fire in the great hearth crackles into a gentle whisper and the peacock dons its final plume, let's quietly tiptoe into the next shadowy corner of historical meal-making, where things get even more personal and a bit pickled in the flickering warmth of a medieval hearth, with its soot-scented ceiling and ever-dripping cauldron of mysteries. One might have found a rather curious arrangement of smells, some promising, others ominously vegetal. Picture, if you will, a large wooden table, groaning beneath the weight of trenchers, those flat, stale bread plates doubling as dishware, and a gaggle of nobles and slightly mouldy cheeses eyeing each other suspiciously. And there, scattered among the fare, was an unassuming little green garnish, a sprig of parsley, not just decorative, dear listener. No, parsley had solemn purpose. In medieval times, it was believed to freshen the breath after garlicky dishes and, more importantly, to sober you up, a medieval breath mint and coffee in one. So the next time you flick one aside on your restaurant plate, know you're dismissing centuries of herbal hope. Now, as you gently settle into your pillow realm, let's drift from the candlelit feasting hall to the realm of strange etiquette, because medieval dining was about more than just what you put in your mouth. It was a whole performative act of not horrifying your neighbors. You see, medieval table manners forbade several things: urinating under the table, thankfully, combing your hair near the food, debatably still an issue at casual brunch, and, most disturbingly, licking your hunting knife clean in public. That's right, sharing knives was common, and since napkins weren't always around, a sleeve or worse, your own tongue had to suffice, which might explain why the shared salt cellar, the communal bowl of salt, was treated with reverence. Positioned closest to the lord or lady, salt was precious, literally and socially. Being seated above the salt meant you were important, with a capital I. Below the salt, you might as well have been composting. Even today, we retain this ancient reverence for salt in our language. He's worth his salt. She salts away money. We spill the salt, then toss a pinch over the left shoulder, allegedly into the devil's eye, just in case he's lurking behind us like a moody kitchen ghost. But perhaps the most suspiciously lingering medieval tradition is the modern buffet. That's right. Long before sneeze guards and crab legs under fluorescent light, there was the releve, a dizzying display of courses laid out all at once for guests to pick and choose. Grand households, especially in the late medieval period, loved nothing more than a good spread of cold meats, heavily spiced pies, and gleaming towers of jelly that quivered like scandal. Guests would drift by, assessing their options, while servants, dressed like culinary shadows, refilled dishes and kept things respectably lukewarm. The trick was to appear nonchalant as a goat's cheese soufflé slowly deflated in public. Sound familiar? Congratulations. Your office holiday party is apparently a time machine. And then there's the bread bowl, the doughy marvel found today under stews in themed pubs or at festivals that smell suspiciously of turkey legs and funnel cake. In the Middle Ages, this wasn't for kitsch. It was practicality and class warfare. Trenchers made of rough bread absorbed the meat juices and sauces of the upper crust and were then often handed off to the poor. So the next time you're faced with artisan soup in a sourdough bowl, just know you're participating in the slow gentrification of medieval charity. We should also mention how many of these habits were born from a delicate cocktail of religious fervour and gastrointestinal suffering. Fasting, for example, wasn't just soul cleansing. It doubled as a rudimentary detox. Fish days were observed with religious rigour, though enforcement varied wildly. One bishop allegedly permitted beaver tails on fast days, arguing that they were more fish than anything else. A pioneering act of ecclesiastical seafood tax law, if there ever was one. And speaking of creatures of dubious classification, let us spare a thought for the blank-faced peacock, a bird that graced noble tables more as spectacle than sustenance. Recooked after being roasted, it was often stitched back into its own skin, feathers still intact, and served with elegance and what we can only assume was a haunting aroma. As you exhale into your pillow and the dream pantry opens one slow wooden hinge at a time, imagine those medieval halls quieting at last. The bells toll the end of feasting. Trenchers are scraped and given away. Roast swans are returned to taxidermy. And parsley, patient little parsley, remains untouched. Let us dim the torches here, on this curious banquet of traditions. There's just one final course left, but it isn't what you think. And here we are, at the table's end. The candle burns low, the ale's gone warm, and the medieval dinner guests, at least the ghosts of them, are slipping away into the shadows of time, quietly burping up their pottage. Odd, isn't it? The more we sniff around the pointy corners of the Middle Ages, the more we find their strange customs snoozing quietly in the oversized armchairs of modern life. Yes, even now, somewhere out there, someone is doing something the medieval way, without knowing they're halfway to being a 14th century peasant. Take a thoughtful chew on this. Medieval people didn't use forks until surprisingly late. The fork, to them, was exotic, foreign, suspiciously graceful, far too dainty for a culture proud of stabbing its meat and bread with nothing but a knife, a spoon, and a touch of divine providence. Forks arrived in Europe like awkward cousins at a family reunion. Useful, but immediately distrusted. They were called diabolical. Perhaps because they resembled that other three-pronged instrument rumoured to be brandished by a certain red fellow from the underworld. And yet, oh, irony of ironies, they did have something called a trencher. A stale, often reused slice of bread used as a plate. This edible dish absorbed sauces and drippings like a soggy sponge, which, let us be honest, modern sandwiches have attempted to copy with far too much enthusiasm. Every French dip ever made owes a smidge of gratitude to a medieval trencher and a complete disregard for dishware. And the feasts. Not the elegant candle-lit affairs you may envision, but rather sprawling, raucous displays of social climbing via goose liver. The noble classes used food not just for fuel, but for flexing. Serving a roasted peacock, sewn back into its own skin, and re-feathered for the table, as if it were taxidermied by someone both enthusiastic and undercaffeinated, was the culinary version of driving a sports car through a puddle on purpose. Fast forward to today, and somehow that spirit remains. Ever seen a towering charcuterie board assembled by someone who whispers the phrase "locally sourced" like it's a magic spell? That's the ghost of a medieval feast, now politely served with fancy pickles and the thin tiers of artisan cheese. Meanwhile, influencers pose with bone marrow toast, a practice suspiciously close to medieval folk sucking actual marrow from bones. Although they didn't frame it as fine dining, so much as not starving. And speaking of bones, did you know that in many medieval homes, it was polite to toss them on the floor? Right there, under the table. Why? Because dogs, rats, and occasionally your neighbor's third child would clean up your leftovers. Compare that to today's birthday dinners, where people think it's edgy to throw peanut shells on the ground at a steakhouse. That's not rustic rebellion. You're just borrowing from the banquet habits of Sir Geoffrey the Sloppy. Even spice culture has a familiar twinkle. In an age where food preservation was more about surviving than thriving, spices were a dazzling luxury. The upper crust hoarded cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg like aromatic gold. Want to impress your guests? Dump half the spice trade on a roast boar, of course. Today, this lingers in our obsession with outrageously specific spice blends. Pumpkin spice being less of a flavor and more of a seasonal identity crisis we willingly sprinkle into hot milk. And let us not forget the famous pie surprise. One of the more theatrical inventions, medieval bakers would place live birds inside pies, so when cut open at grand feasts, the winged guests would fly out, likely into chandeliers and faces. This gimmick surely shocked peasants and minor nobility alike, especially the ones already clutching small goblets of wine and unprepared for avian air raids. If that sounds far-fetched, remember, we now celebrate birthdays with cakes that explode glitter and fondant recreations of the recipient's favorite handbag. What once was a fluttering pigeon is now a coconut-flavored volcano. And so, dear listener, here at this sleepy intersection of history and habit, we realize we never quite left those long hall tables behind. Bits of trenchers, spiced meats, and illicit elbows still linger in our modern feasts. Time has painted over the rough edges, but the brushstrokes are forgiving. They let just enough of the past sneak through, like a whiff of cloves in a dusty cupboard, or the faint crunch of a biscuit eaten far too loudly during a polite tea. Now, as the fire dies down and the last peas of the evening roll lazily across the platter, it's time to let the clinking goblets and feasting ghosts retire. Settle in. The candles are out. May your dreams be filled with gentle banquets, moderations of spice, and absolutely no birds in your pastry. Good night.